Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Let's see what's happening, shall we? Let's talk to Stacy.
Max, apparently disorder will come, as Confucius warned. Well, this is an entertaining title. I like it, and it's from Egon von Greyerz. He says that when bubbles burst, we will discover how very few superior men there actually are, as defined by Confucius, who said, "The superior man, when resting in safety, does not forget that danger may come. When in a state of security, he does not forget the possibility of ruin. When all is orderly, he does not forget that disorder may come. Thus, his person is not endangered, and his states and all their clans are preserved." So Egon von Greyerz, who runs goldswitzerland.com, he's a big gold bug. He believes that disorder is coming and no man is prepared. Many states are not prepared for the disintegration of the everything bubbles.
Yeah. I know. I've been studying these gold bugs, for a while. And as gold continues to lacklusterly go nowhere, they're reaching deeper and deeper into the canon of quotes to come up with something to say. Here we are quoting Confucius to add some content into the blogosphere while gold continues to do nothing. Well, that's an interesting idea, and the disorder may come someday, and we may see gold go up someday. That's true. It hasn't happened in the last year or so, but it might happen.
He just have one or two sentences in this piece about gold, saying that he believes gold is a good safe haven for this. But in particular, he's talking about inflation and possibly hyperinflation coming. In the second half, we'll be speaking to Rick Ackerman, who does not at all believe in hyperinflation or actually mass inflation. He sees deflation coming, and therefore that will be the chaos. That will be the disorder to come. So we're showing two sides of this argument from the outside the Bitcoin world. What the other analysts looking at the data of the debt, what they see. So Egon von Greyerz sees that all the debt causing inflation. Rick Ackerman sees all of that debt causing deflation. In terms of what Egon von Greyerz is presenting, he's saying, for example, that just take the U.S. When Trump was elected in November of 2016, U.S. debt was at $20 trillion. Based on history, I forecast that it would reach $28 trillion in January 2021, and it did, and $40 trillion in 2025. At the same, most market observers found this forecast preposterous, but sadly, they hadn't studied history, which told us what would happen. Of course, it has hit $28 trillion, and now he's predicting that, in fact, that forecast of $40 trillion by 2025 is an underestimate, that it'll be even higher.
I don't seem to understand how the economy can take on so much debt and at the same time prices for stuff are skyrocketing, right? So in the example of houses, houses are up like 20% a year. And that's not considered inflation. And the government, in response, is printing lots of money or expanding credit to encumber the country with more debt. So it's not inflation or deflation. It's a case of misrepresentation, essentially, in that you've got those who have the most capital also own the media outlets. So they present an illusion, a hologram, a story, propaganda on the mainstream media outlets. And they use terms like inflation and deflation. They use them incorrectly. They should be talking about feudalism and neo-feudalism. They should be talking about hyperinflation, as Bitcoin is demonstrating. Everything is in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin. So those are the real things that are happening for real. But you don't hear that.
No, the narrative that they present is that they celebrate and applaud it, right? So when your house price is going up $50,000 a year, the median price went up last year in the United States, $50,000. Well, they celebrate like that's income for you. You have more equity, you have more value, you're rich, you're getting rich. They don't describe that as something that we should be against, that i.e. the next generation gets locked out of the housing market. I remember very early in Keiser Report, actually, back in like 2010, we covered Warren Buffett actually said that at that time. It was after the collapse of the housing market. And he said, I don't know why anybody celebrates house prices rising like that anyway. It's just an intergenerational wealth transfer. It's not an asset like any ordinary person should consider. It's it's a huge cost. It's a burden.
Well, can someone explain to me why Jay Powell over at the Fed and Janet Yellen at Treasury will look at house price up 20%, annualizing appreciation 20%. They'll look at that and they'll show a chart of that and they'll discuss that and they'll call that deflation. Can you explain to me why they call that deflation? It's like holding up, a duck and saying, this is a turtle, right? Or it's like pointing to the sky and saying, the sky is orange. I mean, it's a patently false statement. It's a frickin' lie. It's a lie. It is a lie. So where's the New York Times? Where's the Washington Post? Where's CNN? Where's the mainstream media? These are two important people in American life. And they lie. The ugly lie from Jay Powell and Janet Yellen. They lie. And yet no one's covering this. But people are suffering. So I wish that there wasn't the amount of suffering that there is, but there's nothing I can do about it because there's a tolerance for lying, sadly.
Well, if your net worth depends on that lie, then you end up, believing it. You're willing to suspend disbelief that anything else could happen. Now, in terms of that U.S. government debt and what Egon von Greyerz sees as his future in terms of where the debt is going, he also gives some really interesting data on the compounding, how much debt is compounding in America on the government level. So he said, based on current situation of the U.S. economy and the forecasted deficits and credit expansion, $40 trillion in 2025 is too low. And we are now looking at U.S. debt of $50 trillion. Remember that when Reagan took over in 1981, U.S. debt was under $1 trillion. So 44 years later, the debt is forecast at $50 trillion in 2025. That is an astounding compound annual growth rate of 28% of U.S. debt between 1981 and 2025. And this figure does not include potential defaults in credit or derivatives markets, which could increase the $50 trillion exponentially. Total U.S. debt of $84 trillion can never be repaid, and nor can it be serviced at non-manipulated market rates.
But let me explain the ugly truth of what's happening in America. So you've got these tens of trillions of dollars worth of debt and heading to $50 trillion worth of debt, which is just another way to say U.S. government Treasury bond.
Yeah.
Which are currently, the 30 years are roughly 2%. Now, how do the coupon or the interest on those 30-year paid? They're paid from taxes collected from taxpayers. And taxpayers pay those taxes to the federal government, who in turn pay off the bondholders. Who own those bonds? The richest 0.1%. It's a wealth transfer mechanism. So it's not inflation, it's not deflation, it's neo-feudalism. It's the U.S. government in cahoots, Janet Yellen, Jay Powell, and whoever the president is at this time, I'm not keeping track, but they essentially coordinate and conspire to issue trillions of dollars worth of debt, and the interest has to be paid by the U.S. taxpayer. Most of your taxes now go to the top 0.1% to pay their bond interest by design. That's not inflation. That's not deflation. That's not democracy. That's not a republic. That's neo-feudalism. And the people, obviously, who can't afford health care, can't afford housing, can't afford education, who are living in the mud, living in the dirt in America, opiate addicts, strung out on dope all day, they're not having a good time. But nobody covers it. Because if they did, as you say, they would lose their jobs.
Right. Well, again, like a lot of people like the inflation and the house prices that are the result of these huge amounts of debt. But also the way Egon von Greyerz describes that is he's like, okay, the derivatives are going to collapse as well, just as Brooksley Born predicted back in 2000 that it would cause a financial crisis, as it did in 2008, and it will do in 2021 or 22 or 23 soon, once it all collapses. But that sounds deflationary to me. So just as Rick Ackerman in the second half will argue, but he's saying that that will cause a currency crisis, and all hyperinflations are a currency crisis. So he thinks that it will cause the currency grid to collapse and therefore cause the hyperinflationary thing. So, watch the episode, make your own decision on it. But here's another example of people celebrating. Australia, we've covered that. We've had Steve Keen on many times over the years, who was always talking about how the bubble is unsustainable there. And yet Australian house prices forecast to see the sharpest rise since the 1980s. At least in the introductory paragraph, they do present the downside of this, as we have done here on the show. In grim news for Aussies trying to get their foot on the ladder of the property market, house prices are tipped to soar by a massive 17% this year across our capital cities, marking the fastest pace of growth since the late 1980s. So they're establishing that the younger generation, as Warren Buffett said, it's a wealth transfer from the young generation to the older. And they do point out that it's all to do with government programs. The government is intervening in Australia on behalf of a certain sector of people, i.e. the voters that vote the most, the ones that will be happy with the price gains and therefore continue voting for those policies, whereby, those struggling to get on the housing ladder, hopefully for the politician, they're working 3 or 4 jobs to save enough money to get on the housing ladder, so they don't have time to go vote. So, these are this is why these schemes happen, is enough. If you get enough of the voters to support your scheme, then obviously you can continue to win re-election.
Yeah, these terms are ludicrous. So it's like you have a shop on Main Street somewhere in America. The government agents show up with baseball bats and they smash everything in the shop. They steal all the inventory and they set fire to your store. Is your response going to be, gosh, I'm really suffering from deflation? No, that's not what's happening. It's a coordinated heist by the plutocrats against the many. And the result is feudalism, neo-feudalism. And the whole lockdown is just preparation for mass incarceration, I'm afraid. But that's the life in the big city.
Well, certainly the wealth gap did explode in the past year, and that is the setup of this debt. Whether it's causing inflation or deflation or hyperinflation, the fact is there is a massive feudal-like situation where the likes of Jeff Bezos, the multi-billionaires became closer to trillionaire status in the past year. And you can't deny that. That's in the facts and the data, and that's because all the money printing does boost asset prices. That's what the Fed wants. That's what, as Danny Blanchflower, who used to be at the Bank of England, he said that's what they wanted as well by quantitative easing. So that's what they've got. But whether or not it causes, disorder will come.
Confucius, what a smart guy. We'll be back. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. It's time now to go to Rick Ackerman of rickackerman.com. He's a former market maker turned stock picker and newsletter publisher. Rick, welcome back.
Max, thanks for inviting me on. Always a pleasure.
Now, you write that Biden's $2.2 trillion project that he's working on is a Trojan horse. All right. What do you mean by that?
Supposedly about 5% of that money is for potholes, roads, and bridges, and the other 95% is in one way or another toward what we call social engineering, and there's even a little bit of weather control in there. So I'm afraid that this $2 trillion starter kit is just a down payment on an environmental plan that could cost a lot more.
It's no boondoggle left behind. It seems like we're getting back to a period in American economic history of boondoggles. And because the folks who put those up, of course, make a lot of money at the expense of the taxpayer. It looks like taxes are going up across the board, Rick. What do you think?
Just great. The stock market hasn't figured that out yet, that they're serious about raising taxes. And, it raises the question, if we've been spending trillions up to this point for that we're essentially untaxed, why do we have to start taxing now?
Yeah, that's one of the mysteries of life. The there's an interesting development in corporate America, a chip shortage. So automobile companies are not really delivering cars, and this is rippling through the entire economy. Is this the beginning of a major infrastructure kind of crisis where America has shipped its jobs overseas for decades? It hasn't invested in chip manufacturing in decades. You know, they've got less than 5% of the chip market. They used to have over 50%. Is this the beginning of a kind of coming to realization that the lack of an industrial policy, I guess you could put it one way, for decades, and the financialization that took its place has run its course? And is this a protracted? Is this just a blip in the, or is this a protracted kind of crisis on the chip and everything that goes with it, Rick?
Well, I think the difficulty here is, you know, when you talk about spending money on infrastructure, or even for that matter, wafer fab plants that you build for $5 to $10 billion. The question is, building for what? And, you know, you have to be able to envision the economy of the future to get the infrastructure right. And right now, I think we're really adrift as to what the economy might be. You know, I think the average working man looks at it, and he's doing whatever to make a living. But there's so many things happening in the economy about which you could ask the question, well, does this really contribute to the economy? So we've got this notion about diving in head first with 5G transmissions and things like that. But I think there's really a huge unanswered question as to what economies it will support.
Just more kind of a return to unimaginative thinking. Meanwhile, the debt surpassed 28 trillion in the U.S. Money supply increased by 25% last year. How do you now? Let's get into the nitty gritty of portfolio management. You know, you've got a classic portfolio of stocks and bonds. Typically, you have to know how to allocate. If 28 trillion in debt, does that mean anything, Rick?
It really doesn't, and you know, it's a big number, so it has to have consequences. In my way of looking at it, even though we look at it and say, well, wink, wink, nobody's ever really going to pay it. In fact, we will have to pay it, and that's kind of where that was my starting point, maybe 40 years ago when I read C.V. Myers on the coming deflation. Eventually, all of that will have to be repaid, if not by the borrower, then by the lender. And so 28 trillion is a number we can't even wrap our heads around that. But you have much bigger economies. I keep coming back to the derivatives market, which amounts to something like, depending on whose estimate, a $1 quadrillion to $2 quadrillion. So that is so much bigger than the actual global economy in goods and services. So it's really hard to put $28 trillion into perspective, but trust me, it will all have to be repaid at some point.
The number one component of the global economy is creating debt. It vastly surpasses the underlying component, any other component in the economy. So the number one activity of these major economies is just to print debt. And the number one reason they print debt is to transfer income from taxpayers to the people who own the debt. I mean, that's not even, when we say inflation versus deflation, it seems like it's a losing argument from the get-go. We should be talking about feudalism versus non-feudalism. It seems like feudalism to me, Rick. You just have an out-of-control oligarchs who are debting the economy to death. That's feudalism, Rick.
I think the word feudalism really touches on it almost answers the question of inflation or deflation. You know, I've held to a deflation end game simply because when you ask the question, well, which way is it going to go? It will go in a way that most benefits the big players, the really big money interests who have done all the lending into mortgage markets and who essentially constitute the lenders in all bond markets. So the game, things are definitely going to go their way, although I don't think it's going to be controllable. But, you know, when you take mortgage debt alone, it's an encumbrance. And that's what when I look at deflation, I don't talk about an increase or decrease in the money supply. I simply talk about an increase in the real burden of debt. So I think we're all going to be encumbered in the future, and I don't think the mortgage lenders are going to allow us to peel a few $100,000 bills from our hyperinflated wallets as payment for our mortgages. So we'll always be under mortgage debt, which is the biggest piece of what most people owe. And that's why I'm very strongly convinced that all mortgages will eventually be rewritten as leases.
So once again, to follow up on that, the sense of ownership disappears, and you have people are indentured servants, effectively, and the idea of private property gets deaded out of existence. And so, as you point out, your main thesis for many years now has been deflation. And to follow up on what we just said, it's more structural. In other words, usually when you say inflation versus deflation, you're saying, well, there's a business cycle, and sometimes, the debts get high, and then central banks might increase rates if GDP is going at too rapid a pace, and then there's a dynamic there, and they're managing the economy. But you're saying, no, there's no business cycle. There's only one cycle. It's down to permanent deflation, a wealth transference to the top that's never going to structurally change. And you're saying property owners lose everything and become leasees on this economy. I mean, that's kind of the bigger picture, Rick, yes?
They've been eased into that situation, Max. And in California, you go down to Orange County and you buy a little 1,100 square foot rancher for $800,000. And I think no one who's in those homes really thinks, well, I'm ever going to own it, I'm ever going to pay it off. It's just a matter of maybe prices will increase and I'll trade up to something else then I can afford even less. So it's been kind of a Ponzi, but over time, the idea of actually being a homeowner, of owning an $800,000, 1,100 square foot rancher that is not worth anything near that, it's not feasible anymore. So as far as property ownership, we don't really own these homes anymore, especially in places where home prices are phenomenally inflated.
To stick on your theme of deflation, you would therefore imagine that the 30-year bond, which is currently yielding about 2%, you see room for the yield to go down even more as the central banks engage in yield control, which would just be more purchases and more control by the central banks, and that would just keep the same widening of all the wealth and income gaps on track to just get worse and worse. So on the bond market, Rick, I'm taking the 30-year bond at 2%. You see this going lower in the yield, I guess, is what you're thinking, right?
Yes, I do. And even though talking about deflation is very counterintuitive, when you see all the monetization and the fiscal ramping up that's going on all over the world right now, deflation is very counterintuitive. But I think you have to sort of separate out what you would call a process by which we've been keeping deflation at bay from kind of a day of reckoning when we really need inflation in a big way, and a lot of it very quickly. So the best arguments I've seen against deflation, or at least the pro-inflation arguments, come from people who deeply understand what the Fed does. They understand exactly how the Fed puts money into the system. And for that reason, they understand that the Fed's ability to do that is theoretically unlimited. And that's what's happened. We've had sort of an accretion of inflation, and we've had monetization and a fiscal blowout that is part of an ongoing process. And so the hyperinflation guys say, hell yeah, if the Fed can do whatever it takes. And that's true if you look at it as a process. But if you look at it, the system is someday imploding under its own weight, the counter inflation that would be needed to prevent that implosion it has to happen in 36 hours. You know, the Fed would have to sort of take this giant hole that's blown out in the bubble and patch it up as it's deflating. So that's the key flaw, I think, in the hyperinflation logic, that somehow the Fed will be able to counteract. And even in some imploding systems, the Fed can't do what it's doing now. You cannot monetize a collapsing pension system. And if you take as a given that Illinois' pension system will be the first to go, it's not the same for the Fed trying to inflate financial assets, real estate, and the stock market, as it is to inflate a collapsing pension system.
All right, hold on there. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. I'm going to carry this over to a second segment, but thanks for being on this Keiser Report. Rick.
Thanks for having me on, Max. Always a pleasure.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Rick Ackerman of rickackerman.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.